Bees pollinate 1/3 of our food supply. Propolis is the bees' immune system. It's the protective barrier between them and the outer world. Look for raw honey and do your best to look for a honey that's pesticide-free.
Backstory, like how'd you get into this?
Yeah. So growing up, I had chronic tonsillitis. I don't know if you've ever had tonsillitis or maybe strep throat, something like that. It's just viral, painful, and I'm allergic to a few different strains of antibiotics. So it was always really difficult for me to solve this problem. And I would get it like once a month. It was pretty horrible. And I was basically always sick. I had a really weak immune system. I tried everything conventional. I tried everything natural. Nothing worked. I couldn't find a place for myself. And I was just sick a lot. And that was my life. And when I was in college, I did a semester abroad. I was in Europe studying. And when I got really sick, I went to a pharmacy there. And the pharmacist gave me Propolis. And
Hmm.
I had never heard of Propolis before. I knew about honey, but I didn't know the bees did anything beyond honey. And I used it, and it was the first time something worked. In about 5 days, I made a full recovery. And that was the start of my obsession with bee products. From there, I started incorporating all these different bee products into my routine, doing a ton of research. And then I became so obsessed that when I finished my time abroad and went back to college, I started beekeeping. And that's
Wow.
how I really got into all of this.
That's so exciting. Beekeeping just based on your experience with propolis.
Yeah, I mean, it was really profound for me because I had been sick and I felt like I had tried everything. And for me to finally find something and, in a few days make a full recovery and then stop getting sick. I mean, I was in Europe for 7 months. And after solving that bout of tonsillitis, I didn't get it again, which was the longest stretch I'd ever gone in my life. And the only new addition was really propolis. And, I started using pollen and some other bee products as well. And I was doing so much research on it, and I realized that, propolis is known for being antiviral, antimicrobial, antifungal, anti-inflammatory. So it makes sense that I had that effect. And I just became really obsessed with it. And then when I went back home, I couldn't really find propolis anywhere. In North America, there's tons of honey, tons of Manuka honey, but it propolis just isn't really a household name. And so I was like, I need to get this for myself and I want to learn more. And I've had this really impactful experience. And I was like, I love nature. This could be a cool, weird hobby. And it ended up being my life's passion.
What do your friends and family think when you told them that you were going to become a beekeeper?
Oh, they thought I was insane. I was also, this is like in 2012, I was in college. And, I was like, it's not a normal after school hobby for a college kid, certainly not at that time. So they thought it was pretty weird. Um, and I sort of at that time had a dream of building a company around it and sharing it with the world, but I was graduating with negative funds and I was fortunate to have a good job offer in finance out of school. And I was really encouraged to take that because it sounds insane to start a bee product company. So people thought it was like a cute, quirky hobby I was going to grow out of, I think, at that time. And I ended up going into finance and learned a lot. But, my heart is with this. Like, I never really cared about being in finance. And so then when I finally left to start this company, once again, I had everyone echo those kind of early concerns of like, is this a good decision? You should just stay put. Um, but yeah, I mean, it was the best decision I ever made.
That's amazing. In those early days, were you harvesting all the different bee products from your own bees?
Yeah. So that's the kind of nice thing I like to share is that long before this was a company, long before I was like trying to sell anything, I was just making these things for myself. Like
Mm.
this is how I solved my health problems. And so there was no pressure. I was just experimenting for me. And so when I was a college student, I started as a beekeeper's apprentice. Literally, he taught me everything, and I was really fortunate as well to have a great mentor. His name's John. He was a retired biochemist from Romania who had moved to Canada to like be a recluse and write books. And
Wow.
at the time, I was a TA for my chemistry class, so I had this really cool kind of reference point for everything, where I was going into the apiary and playing with the bees and harvesting and extracting, doing everything myself, and then I would bring it over to the lab and perfect, my version of perfection on like how to extract alcohol properly and like make the certain formula that I just like for myself. So it was a really great time to just be creative.
That's super interesting. Were you wearing a beekeeper like costume?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I
We
had a situation one time actually where I was at cheerleading practice and in my bag I had my Beekeepers suit and someone pulled it out because they were just going through my bag to like grab something. And, everyone was like, "Carly, are you going to murder someone? Like, what is happening?" Like, it's like a to them, it looked like a hazmat suit, so
It looks like a fencing costume, doesn't it?
yeah, it's like a full head to toe white jumpsuit
Yeah, and then there's like a
with
thing
a
over your
yeah,
head.
with
Yeah,
a
so you could
veil.
like either be fencing on the side or you're like a beekeeper, which is super interesting. Sydney, my assistant, she turned me on to this TikTok account of this woman, this woman who like is a beekeeper also, but she does it completely without a suit. And I was
Mhm, I
like,
know who you're talking
yeah,
about.
is that I'm I'm generally not a fan of insects, but
Mhm,
I've warmed up to bees.
yep.
People who follow me on Instagram will know that I recently actually tried to save a bee. I found a bee that was hurt and I tried to save
Oh,
it. I didn't
that's
know what I was
beautiful.
doing though, yeah. And I don't think I succeeded, but I think there's a lot of confusion about bees
Mhm,
and generally I would say that the sentiment is more of like one of fear
totally.
that bees are just out to hurt us. Is that not necessarily the case?
It is totally not the case. Bees are crucial to our life on this planet. So, bees pollinate one third of our food supply. Without the bees, we would, I mean, things couldn't grow. A lot of the natural foods that we eat that are so important for our health, we really would not be able to have access to them. Like it would become a food desert. And not to mention, bees pollinate over 40% of plants and flowers, and other creatures rely on them. So if you remove the bees, the entire ecosystem kind of falls apart.
Wow.
They're critical. And then in terms of the fear, I totally understand bees can sting and a sting will hurt, but bees don't actually want to sting humans. So when a bee stings you, it has these barbed things on its stinger and it latches into your skin and it pulls out the bee's abdomen. So the bee will actually die
Wow.
when they sting human skin. They can sting other creatures and survive, but for humans, they weren't really meant to sting us. And
Interesting.
it's really just something they do when they feel threatened. So I've gone in with my bees wearing like a tank top and jeans. I mean, if I'm like really getting in there, I typically will wear a full suit, but I mean, I've done it in like shorts and a t-shirt and that sort of thing. And if you're really calm, they're like, if they don't feel threatened, you're really calm, you're really gentle, you're not that likely to get stung.
Wow.
Mhm.
It's super interesting. How many times have you been stung over the course of your life? I'm just curious.
Oh my gosh, hundreds,
Hundreds.
hundreds. But like, I've done dumb things, like gone in to the apiary with sunscreen on that was scented that pissed them off. And like, they're very sensitive to scent.
Hmm.
Um, and I've spent so much time around bees, but given how much time I've spent around bees and how much time I've spent about around bees handling things with no protection, no bee suit on, it's actually not that much when you think about it.
Wow. It is fascinating, though, what you said about how if you were to take bees off of the planet, that life would, I mean, as we know it, would cease
Mhm.
to exist.
Yeah.
But if you were to take, I mean, it just got me thinking, if you were to take humans off the planet, life would
I
flourish.
know, I know.
It's so sad.
Yeah.
Um, but that's really interesting. So currently, are bees, what are the primary threats
Mhm.
that bees face currently?
So the number one threat, in my opinion, and there's a lot of debate around this because pesticide companies tend to be well funded,
Hmm.
but the number one threat, in my opinion, is pesticides. So in 2006, DDT was taken out of the game. I think people probably remember the imagery of birds dying and all of that.
Silent Spring, Rachel Carson. She kind
Hmm.
of was the original whistleblower.
Yeah, and so when they took DDT out, it was replaced with a substance called neonicotinoids. And that is now it's very commonly used in the US. Now, other parts of the world don't, they've banned it actually. Parts of Europe have banned it. In Canada, they instituted a partial ban in certain provinces. So we know this stuff is bad, but in the US, as of now, it's still pretty widely used. And I really hope that changes. And, it's not good for us. It's a water soluble substance. It degrades our soil. But for the bees, it's a neuroactive substance and it really distorts their spatial reasoning and it's causing a ton of problems. And so, we've seen a decline in bee populations over the years, and pesticides are hugely problematic. And it's really interesting as well because at Beekeepers Naturals, we do pesticide free beekeeping.
Hmm.
So we make sure that there are no pesticides anywhere near our bees. And we do that for a few reasons. One, for product quality, of course, because organic, frankly, just isn't enough when it comes to bees, because just because your bees sit on organic land doesn't mean they can't fly next door, and they'll fly for like a 5-mile radius. So if they fly next door and the neighbors are doing something dirty, it can get into your end product. So you have to be really careful. So we do natural beekeeping, pesticide free. We're really intense about that. And what we've seen is our hives are flourishing year over year, contrary to population trends. So, I mean, that's not the largest sample and it's not a perfect study, but we're literally seeing our bees thrive without pesticides. And we also know, like there was a study that came out from Harvard, we know that these pesticides are harming the bees. So
Hmm.
that's the number one culprit. Other factors, urbanization, climate change. Um, a big thing is monocropping. Just the agricultural practices have really changed. So if you think about it, you know, let's like think about it like a monocrop. It's one type of plant and it has one bloom period. So there's a certain time of year where the bees have this awesome buffet. And then after that bloom, it's kind of a desert.
Hmm.
So unless they're planting other, margin planting is a really great practice for people who do have monocrops, to allow for for varied foliage around the perimeter so that bees have different food.
And monocropping, just for people who are not super familiar with that term, it's a completely unnatural process, right? It's just like human intervention will grow certain crops that are seasonal, and
Yep.
then when they are not in season, that it's just dead.
Yeah.
It's
I
like
mean,
it's like a
It's a
ecological dead
it's a
zone.
dead zone, yeah. I mean, if you think, like, economically, it makes a lot of sense because we have, like, our dedicated almond growers and our blueberry growers and people who specialize in these different things, and they can, maximize the yield, but it's not how things used to be. It's not, you know, varied wildlife and different plant types, and it's just, one organized type of plant.
Hmm. Very interesting. Do bees have any natural predators other than us, perhaps?
Wasps will
Wow.
go at bees. Wasps are really scary because they can sting and sting without dying, whereas bees die. So wasps actually give bees a bad rap.
Is
But
there anything good about wasps, or are they
I
just
mean, they're
evil?
pollinators too.
Oh, they
So
are.
I've had my bees terrorized by wasps at times. So I'm not a fan, but like I appreciate and respect them as pollinators of this planet.
Are you generally cool with like insects?
Oh yeah, I'm like a bug girl.
You are. That's
Yeah.
so interesting. I am very like squeamish when it comes to bugs, especially like, I mean, roaches, water bugs, things like that. I grew up in New York City.
Mhm.
If I saw a water bug on the sidewalk, I would literally cross to the other side of the street.
My partner will literally call me into the room to like take a spider
Wow.
outside.
I don't know. I feel like we have these like innate fears, some of us,
Mhm.
Um, it's super interesting. So you've brought to the market all these incredible products. And as you mentioned, I think most people are just familiar with like honey.
Mhm.
One of my favorite bee products, and has been for a long time, is bee pollen. How do you, I mean, like bees, they're just like this untapped reservoir of amazing things. Like it started for you with propolis, and
Mhm.
then like walk me through the process as you began to discover all these other um, products that bees were creating.
Yeah. So, I mean, I first fell in love with propolis. And again, like many of us, zero awareness of what the word propolis meant. Like, I really just thought that bees make honey. And it's really interesting because bees are actually not native to North America. They were brought over by European settlers. So,
Hmm.
in other parts of the world, propolis, royal jelly, pollen, commonly used in traditional medicine in certain parts of the world. But in North America, we really only think of bees for honey, or depending on what industry you're in, pollination. Um, and so my first experience with propolis, I mean, I was just sick and it was literally the first time something worked. And then as I started to research it, I found, I just went on PubMed and was like looking up propolis, tons of studies, tons of science. And then it was really interesting because I realized like this isn't new. I was like, what is this new magic I stumbled upon? And of course, it is very old. The first recorded human use of propolis dates back to 300 BC.
Wow.
And, in the 17th century, propolis was listed in the London Pharmacopoeia as an official drug. So this is, before this is like what we've been using as medicine for a very, very long time. So propolis was really, the gateway for the gateway drug for me.
And where do you find, like, how do bees make that? Where is it? How is it harvested?
Great question. So everyone thinks that every bee product is a honey derivative. Not at all. So I'll
Hmm.
do a little beehive 101.
Yeah,
So
please.
I'll start with honey because we all know it. So honey comes from flowers. Bees will go from flower to flower. They have this long tube-like tongue and they suck up the nectar from the flower, carry it back to the hive in their honey stomach, which is like essentially they have two stomachs. One's for digestion, the other is basically a nectar backpack.
Whoa.
They bring it back to the hive, put it into, they basically allow it to ferment. They get all the water out and it becomes the sticky substance that we know and love as honey. And the bees use that as their food. That's their carbs, their energy source. For humans, uh, it's a healthy sweetener. It's full of antioxidants. Honey has antiviral effects as well. It actually has a calming effect on the body. A lot of people will take honey before bed, and then it also helps people to sleep through the night because for people, it helps to balance the glycogen stores in the liver. So if you're a person who wakes up in the middle of the night, a teaspoon of honey before bed can actually be really supportive. So that's honey. And then propolis, while honey is the bee's food, you can think of propolis as the bee's medicine.
Hmm.
So honey comes from flowers, propolis comes from trees or plant and tree resins. So think of like sap as the base ingredient. So the bees will go, they'll collect the sap and the plant and tree resins. And these are the literal immune materials of the plant as well. So you can just kind of see how propolis is more of a medicinal substance than honey. They combine it with their enzymes and they make this sticky amber colored substance called propolis. And they use it to line the hive and keep it germ free. So propolis is the bee's immune system. It's the protective barrier between them and the outer world. They'll even line the inside of the cell walls for newborn baby bees to create a sterile environment. And they have a propolis mat at the front of the hive so everyone
What?
can disinfect. Bees are very smart.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And then propolis, it's like, you know, OG medicine. It's, you know, what you can use to support your overall immune health. It's really something that people can use every day to support their body, protect themselves, bolster their natural defenses. It's also really high in antioxidants. It's anti-inflammatory. There's tons of benefits. A lot of people use it for allergies as well because it's so potent as an anti-inflammatory substance. But that's propolis.
Now,
And
when it comes to propolis, because I know you guys have this incredible spray. And side note, I take like regular like voice singing lessons, and
Mhm.
my teacher, shout out to Deborah Joy. She just randomly, she didn't know that we were seeing each other later today, but she said that this is a great spray for people who have sore throats. If you're a singer, if you're a
Mhm.
public speaker, so she was a big fan of this, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. Um, so my question is it, you know, for best practices, like you use it topically, you spray it on the area? Is it something that you want to ingest and have like,
Mhm.
you know, systemically?
I tell people 3 to 5 sprays in your mouth every single day.
Hmm.
If you are doing, I mean, here's the thing. Health is integral to everything. And there are so many things we do to prioritize it, which is amazing. But if your immune system is not functioning properly, nothing's working. Like you really do want to take the steps to care for your immune system to build up your body naturally. And so 3 to 5 sprays of propolis in the mouth every single day. It's like, you know, your bodyguard in a bottle. You're just bolstering your natural defenses. So that's what I do. People who sing we have so many singers, podcasters, actors, people who use their voice professionally and really rely on it and get the inflammation from working it so much will often take more than that.
Hmm.
But I really believe that everyone should be using propolis every day. I think we can sidestep a lot of different illness and just really, you know, feel a lot better. It's radically changed my immune system. I mean, I haven't had tonsillitis since 2012, which is
Wow.
insane, and I still have my tonsils
And you were struggling with it chronically beforehand.
chronically. I mean, I would miss like 3 weeks of school at a time as a kid, like always sick, always sick.
Wow. So interesting.
I know.
I mean, I love that you found something that works for you. When I spray this in the back of my, it's just so, it's tasty, but it's so soothing as well. I can see how it could definitely be like a life raft after a long day of, you know, vocal performance or
Mhm.
speaking or what have you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like everyday immune health. It's just what you do every day to support your immune system, and the bees are onto something. And again, like we found propolis in Egyptian tombs. Like this is not new. It works very well with the human body. Humans have been using it forever. And the base ingredient is the immune components of the plant as well. So it's got, you know, it's like the plant's immune system, the bee's immune system, and it works really well with ours.
Wow, so interesting. And there is, I mean, you know, because I've definitely done a a PubMed search of propolis, there's a good amount of there's like, there have been clinical trials, there have been like research reviews. People are definitely within the scientific community talking about this substance,
Oh,
but it's
absolutely.
probably just not nearly as well funded as a pharmaceutical agent. And so you're not going to see the kinds of robust, multi-center trials that you're going to see with a drug candidate. But
Totally.
that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not doing something.
For a natural substance that doesn't have, big pharma money funding studies, it actually is a remarkable amount of research.
Hmm.
It was really interesting. During COVID, we saw a huge spike in interest just for propolis because a lot of doctors that have a presence online, a lot of health professionals were talking about propolis as an ingredient to support and protect your immune system. So more and more people are starting to understand propolis and search for it and look for it and understand what it is as an ingredient. But we're still really in the early days of sharing it in North America.
It's great. Well, Europe is so ahead of the curve in so many ways, that it's so great that you were able to find it, and now make it available to everybody in the way that you have. So we've talked about honey, we've talked about propolis. Royal jelly is something that I first heard about when I was a kid, like years ago. And I've never known what it does, or why people like to use it, or I don't even know. Yeah, what is it? What's royal jelly?
So royal jelly. So again, honey is the bee's food. Propolis is the bee's medicine. Royal jelly you can kind of think of as the brain food of the hive. So royal jelly, the nurse bees make it, and a lot of people compare it to like colostrum. So for all newborn baby bees, for the first 3 days of development, they're given royal jelly. It's like breast milk.
Wow.
And then after 3 days, the bees transition off of royal jelly onto a more normal diet, bee diet of honey and pollen. And only the bee who's to become a queen continues with her exclusive royal jelly diet. So that is all the queen is eating.
Is that why it's called royal jelly?
Yeah, it's the queen's food.
It's like bee breast milk.
Yeah.
That bees
Royal jelly has more of a ring,
I was going to ask a really stupid question to be funny, but I'm not going to go there. So royal jelly.
Yeah. So
Tell me
royal
about
jelly.
its properties.
So it's the exclusive food of the queen bee. Really interesting, because if you just look at the queen bee on a biological level, the queen bee she evolves very differently than regular bees. And, I think her royal jelly diet plays a big part in that. So the queen bee is much more robust. If you just Google queen bee versus like regular worker bee, she's jacked, like she's fit.
Wow.
The queen bee will lay around 1,500 babies a day, whereas regular female worker bees don't have reproductive organs. The queen bee will live 3 to 5 years, whereas a regular worker bee during foraging season lives 6 to 8 weeks. They literally work their ass off until they die.
Worker bees don't reproduce.
No, they don't. It's
The
the
queen bee
who
makes
does
them
it
all.
all.
Wow,
Yep.
that is fascinating. And
Mhm.
also, what I've learned is that worker bees are primarily they're all for the most part
women.
female.
All women. The women do everything in the hive.
See, bees also they have this beautiful women's empowerment story to them as well, because they're doing so many good things for the world, and they're mostly women.
Yeah. The male bees, they're called drones.
Women. I could probably get in trouble for that. Not that I care, but we'll say that they're female.
Yeah.
More,
But
more
the
accurate.
male bees are called drones, and their sole purpose in life is reproduction.
Hmm.
Like they basically mate with the queen. They die during this process. The queen will take her like mating flight, have sex in the air with a drone, and he dies.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Goes out good, goes out strong. And then once the queen has once she's pregnant and when it's sort of like approaching fall, the male bees are all kicked out of the hive. The girls are like, hey, you guys are a drain on resources. You're going to need to go. And they just, overwinter like that. So the male bees don't do much.
I had no idea that bees were such feminists.
They are.
I love it. I love it. Hey,
Yeah.
So sometimes I see huge bees flying around.
Mhm.
Are those
Those are bumblebees.
Those are
probably.
Oh, so there's a difference between a worker bee and a bumblebee?
So there's a bunch of different bee species. So honeybees are the ones that we work with at Beekeepers Naturals. Honeybees are the ones that are making the honey. They're the most effective pollinator, but there are tons of different bee species that are great pollinators too. So the big fuzzy ones, those are bumblebees.
Yeah, they're slow and cumbersome, and
They're really cute.
they
I find them
terrify
cute.
me. They terrify me. Glad you find them cute. So those are bumblebees.
Those are bumblebees. Yeah. So yeah, there's a bunch of different types of bees. Um, bumblebees are, so generally speaking, like solitary bees, bumblebees are actually social as well, but solitary bees, there's some bee species that really live on their own. They don't live in like a hive community and they're really unlikely to sting you. There are even stingless bees. Like there's tons of different types of bees all over the world. So yeah, honeybees though, they are the world's most effective pollinators.
Hmm.
So they're, again, all bees are super amazing at pollination, but honeybees are just like efficient.
Wow. So we've talked about propolis.
Mhm.
We've talked about honey.
I should tell you what royal jelly does for humans, though, because it's amazing for bees, but it has some really cool properties that affect humans and specifically affect the brain.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, you mentioned that it was like a brain food. So what does it do to the human
Yeah.
brain?
So royal jelly is really well known for focus, memory, concentration.
Hmm.
It contains acetylcholine. It's one of the only naturally occurring sources. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter basically responsible for brain-body connection. It helps to speed up your transmission system. And then this is like a really cool thing that I like to nerd out on. Royal jelly contains these two fatty acids called 10-HDA and AMP-N1 oxide. And these basically promote BDNF. They act as a catalyst for neurogenesis. So they're really, I mean, a lot of people, I see a lot of people using royal jelly after a concussion, or, with any sort of brain trauma. I use royal jelly on a daily basis. We have these like Be Smart brain shots that I think you've tried. I take those every day, and that's just what I do for focus, memory, concentration. I also try to stay off caffeine, and royal jelly gives you like a nice little energy boost. But royal jelly is really powerful for pretty much supporting your executive functioning.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, the Belixir like capsules that you guys make.
Mhm.
Very interesting. I know there's a lot of people interested in nootropic. Would you consider it a nootropic substance?
Absolutely. Yeah. Our Be Smart shots are definitely nootropics. And so we have the royal jelly in there. And then we have ginkgo biloba, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners know about. And then Bacopa monnieri, it's also an adaptogen. It's an extract from a leaf traditionally used in Ayurvedic medicine that has great properties for the brain as well.
Amazing. So bee pollen, where does bee pollen fit into all
Yeah,
this?
pollen is also one of my favorites. And I'm really sorry because I brought you bee pollen and left it in my Uber, but I'm going to get you more.
Bee pollen is actually like my of all of them, I would say probably my favorite. I eat this stuff by the fistful.
I mean, it's so good for you.
Well before even you got started with Beekeepers Naturals, I was a huge fan of it. It's so good. It's how would you describe the taste? It's like fruity.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the time of year it's harvested and the floral sources. I'm like so good with my bee pollen now that I kind of know what flowers it's coming from. Not always, but sometimes. But bee pollen, you can really think of it. So for the bees, carrying on with our theme here, for the bees, it's their protein source.
Hmm.
So literally the bees will go flower to flower, collect the pollen. They mix it with their enzymes. So they kind of like bunch it up and then they stick it on their hind legs and it's called their pollen pants. So like if you see a picture of a bee with these like yellow balls on their hind legs, that's their pollen pants and they're carrying it back to the hive like that.
Wow.
Yeah, and then it's the bee's protein. So that's what bee pollen is. It's literally the protein source for the bees. The bees eat it. And for humans, I like to think of bee pollen as nature's multivitamin. It is just one of the most nourishing substances. It's full of broad spectrum vitamins, minerals. It's actually got more protein per weight than any animal source. That's per weight. So it's
Hmm.
not that heavy, but it's a really complete food. And so it's something that I take every single day. And I do it for energy boosting, but I really just do it to cover my bases nutritionally because it's so bioavailable and it's just such a potent source of vitamins and minerals.
And it's an actual food. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
a supplement. Next to
Mhm.
honey, it's like the other food that is produced by bees. How do you integrate
Absolutely.
bee pollen into your diet? Do you
I
do
put
you do
it
it like me? Like you just shovel it into your mouth or
So after I work out, it depends what I've done actually. If I'm going to do something that's really intense cardio, I'll take it before because it actually increases your endurance. I'll just like have a spoon of it or like throw back a pollen shot. I sometimes take it after I work out just for recovery. But I'll put it on my smoothie. I put bee pollen on like everything. I sprinkle it on my avocado toast. Anything that you would put like chia seeds or hemp seeds or cacao nibs, anything like that on, I use bee pollen. I even put it on ice cream. I'll like make an ice cream sundae and sprinkle bee pollen on top of it.
that sounds fire. I mean, I put it on the ice creams that I make in my Vitamix. Like I'll just like
Mhm.
blend up some frozen berries and whey protein, which By the way, for any of you guys listening, you can make a really simple ice cream doing this. You just get frozen berries. I like to get a mixed bag of organic berries from like Sprouts or whatever. And you throw like a little bit of almond milk unsweetened and then 2 scoops of protein powder. You blend it up and you mash it down with a tamper and you get this ice cream. And then after that, I love to sprinkle some bee pollen on top. It's so good.
That sounds really good.
Yeah, it's tasty.
That's the thing, though, that I love about all bee products, from propolis to pollen to you name it. They're like food grade, they're very bioavailable, because I have such an issue with, not all supplements are taken in by the body the way we want them to be. A lot of things we just don't really break down, and we titrate and pee out, the $40 supplement we're spending money on. And so bee products, they're really well integrated by your system.
Couldn't agree more. Sometimes I get bee pollen that's really soft, and then other times I get it and it's really firm. Is there a difference in the chemical constituents that account for that variation?
So there's a few things that could be making a difference. One is the floral type it's coming from. There's just, natural variance in the type of pollen. But the other thing is, a lot of pollen, and all pollen's great. So, just take your pollen, everyone. But unless you have very severe allergies, in that case, I would be careful, because it's pollen from the plant. So,
Right.
you know, um, a lot of pollen is dried. So people will harvest it, they'll apply a lot of heat, they'll dry it out, and then they sell it, and it can be a little bit crunchier. So something that we do is, all of our pollen's raw, and even dried pollen is incredibly nutritionally dense. But I like to keep ours raw, because pollen has, like all bee products, really powerful enzymes. Like how the bee is collecting the pollen and how they're bunching it together and transferring it, otherwise it would be a powder, is by mixing it with their enzymes. And bee enzymes are magic. So for the pollen at Beekeepers Naturals, it's completely raw. And that's why we recommend, like, once you open it, it's totally fine before you open it. And if you've opened it already, it's not bad. It's just ideal to keep in the fridge or freezer after you've opened it. Now, when I travel, like I did a road trip this summer, my pollen was sitting in a hot car and I ate it every day. It gets really hot in the hive, so it's not like your pollen's going to go bad, but it is great to preserve the enzymes that way. But sometimes the harder pollen, it's because they've applied a lot of heat and dried it out.
Interesting, but it doesn't degrade the health qualities of
I
it.
mean, it will degrade the enzymes for sure. Anytime you're applying a high heat like that, and like heat as in, so sometimes the reason people will apply heat to pollen sometimes is to clean it. For
Like,
us,
is that like pasteurization or?
sort of, you can think of it that way, just because little things like, sticks, leaves, when you harvest pollen, there's stuff that gets into it. Like how you harvest pollen is, you put this basket kind of under an area of the hive, and the pollen that the bees basically drop, we collect and
Oh,
take that.
wow.
And so there's, people have different methods, but that's what we do. But with that, you get leaves, you'll get like twigs, that sort of thing. And so some people will use a really high heat to clean it. What we do is we use air. So we basically have this huge machine where we like fan it. And so we basically blow out, and it's sort of like a mesh catcher. We blow out anything that's bigger than the pollen granules.
That's so cool. It's definitely one of those things. Like I have to have it in my fridge, and on Greek yogurt, I'll put it in. It's even good on salads, like in salad dressing. It's got a really strong flavor,
Yeah.
so I don't use a lot in salads, but definitely people should check it out. It feels decadent too. I mean, I just like, yeah, I go to town on
It's
that
so
stuff.
funny. When I first started beekeeping, the first time I tried pollen, I was like, no, this is like way too earthy for me. I don't like this taste. And now my body craves it,
Yeah, I love
like
it.
all the time.
It's awesome. I want to go back to honey a little bit, because it's obviously the most common of the products produced by bees, and there are a bunch of different kinds of honey on the market. So maybe you can help us make sense of all that, right? Like you mentioned, I think earlier, Manuka.
Yeah.
What are the different honey types, and what should people be looking for?
Yeah. So Manuka honey, it's a specific type of honey that comes from the Manuka plant. It's native to New Zealand. The Manuka plant's really similar to eucalyptus. So eucalyptus honey would have similar properties.
So Manuka honey doesn't come from a specific type of bee.
No,
Like,
it's a specific type of plant.
got it.
But Manuka got really famous because New Zealand ran studies on it. And they found that Manuka has antiviral capabilities. Now, Manuka is really expensive. And I think that our local honey would have those same antiviral capabilities, but we just haven't done the same studies. We know for sure that propolis is a stronger antiviral source than any honey. Like there's no honey that's going to be a lot of raw honeys have traces of propolis in them, and that's part of their magic. But Propolis specifically, like that's really what you want for immune driven things. And it's going to be much more potent than honey. But as you said, there's a lot of different honey varietals. So when you're looking for honey, so Manuka is great, but do you need to spend a crazy amount of money for like the name Manuka? No, like any raw, good quality honey is going to get you there. Now, a study was done and it found that the darker the honey, the higher the antioxidants. So buckwheat honey, which is a specific, comes from the buckwheat plant. That one has a very earthy flavor. It's not like the sort of like light sweet honey, but it's also got a dark, rich color, kind of molasses looking.
Hmm.
That has the highest antioxidants. And really interesting, there was a study that was looking at buckwheat honey compared to a substance called dextromethorphan. And dextro is like, it's the active ingredient in most cough syrup. So like Robitussin, whatever you would buy at CVS, the traditional cough syrup, typically has dextro in it. And the study was done comparing buckwheat honey to dextro. And it was looking specifically at upper pediatric respiratory infections, so kids with respiratory infections.
Wow.
And it found that buckwheat honey was just as effective.
Wow.
And so when that study came out, I was like, oh my gosh, why would you give a kid or adult dextro and like the sugar cough syrups when buckwheat honey is literally just as effective? So that's why we made our cough syrup.
Wow, that's amazing. So the darker the honey,
Yeah.
generally,
Darker,
the more antioxidants.
the more antioxidants. The key things to look for raw, because if you're buying pasteurized honey, and pasteurized honey just means it's been heated to a really high degree. It's like the type of honey that typically comes out of that squeezy bear is
Mhm.
pasteurized. If it's really liquidy, it's probably been pasteurized unless it was like just harvested. And so you do not want that because that's sugar water.
Hmm.
Pasteurized honey, you've cooked all the nutrients out, you've applied a really high heat. So, you're losing all those antioxidants and all the nutritional properties. So the raw honey is what you want. So always make sure you have that. Now, raw honey will solidify. So sometimes I have people say like, oh, my honey went bad. And I'm like, well, that's impossible because honey is the only food on the planet that never expires. Like they've found honey in Egyptian tombs that's like totally nutritionally intact. And that's a testament to bees' enzymes. It's pretty
Wow.
cool. So yeah, your honey, like it never expires.
That's so
not
interesting.
possible. Yeah. So if your honey's getting hard, it's just crystallizing, which is a natural process. And that's why people pasteurize honey to avoid crystallization because it's more user friendly, squeezes out of a tube. If it pasteurizes, it's harder. You have to kind of heat it up a little bit to soften it. So yeah, but crystallization is a totally natural process. If your honey crystallizes, that's fine. Still eat it. If you want it to be softer, what you can do is heat up some water, stick the jar of honey into the boiling water. You're not going to pasteurize it doing that. You have to work at it to pasteurize it. And that's how you can soften it. But the key thing is look for raw honey and do your best to look for a honey that's pesticide free and organic. What we were talking about earlier, organic does not necessarily mean pesticide free, unfortunately.
That's a big misconception that I
Yeah.
think needs to be dispelled. However, organic does indicate typically that there's there's no
Lower.
there's also they don't use legally they can't use synthetic pesticides,
Mhm.
but organic they still have organic approved pesticides.
Totally.
But I would feel a lot safer. I know that there's like people are listening and be like nature fallacy, like natural doesn't necessarily mean safer, but
Mhm.
when it comes to herbicides, pesticides, and things like that, they use like vitamin D as a natural pesticide, an organic approved pesticide.
Totally. So I wasn't even, first of all, organic is, definitely safer. And for me with my produce, I make a real concerted effort to purchase organic produce because I just don't want the synthetic pesticides, I just don't want to support that
Mhm.
generally. Um, but with bee products, even organic pesticides, it doesn't necessarily mean pesticide free. Because remember, the bees will forage for a 5 mile radius. So that's why, like
Interesting.
at Beekeepers, our apiaries are in the middle of nowhere. We do a ton of work in Canada because it's a massive landmass with a tiny population. So like we have bees in the Rockies. Like our bees are really in the middle of nowhere. And there are definitely places in the US where you can get pesticide free and where or the organic pesticides aren't surrounded by like the gross pesticides, but it's getting harder and harder in the US.
Wow. What about the packaging? Does that matter? Because when you were talking about the plastic bear bottle with the honey, I was thinking, okay, they're pasteurizing this honey, they're heating it up, and then they're putting it probably straight afterwards into this plastic container that, hot liquid plastic container, to me, that's a recipe for exposure to plasticizing compounds.
Yeah, I mean, I'm big on anything that's super hot. I don't want it near plastic. I
Yeah.
haven't seen any research specifically on that relating to honey, but I've seen we know that hot plastic is a bad situation. Now, we have never first of all, we don't pasteurize honey at all at my company. I've actually no, I think one time when I was an apprentice, I pasteurized honey for someone, but I've never pasteurized honey. I mean, I haven't in a long time, and I've certainly never pasteurized it and poured it into anything but glass. So I've never even experimented with that. But I would just avoid the squeezy bear honey if it's pasteurized. Like if you're having honey that's pasteurized and you think you're getting any health benefits, you're not. It's sugar water.
Yeah, super interesting. Speaking of the carbs in honey, it's primarily fructose, right? Have you
Mhm.
done like a
Yeah, and so it's also really interesting. People think that all bee products are high sugar. And like, yes, of course, honey has sugar in it. It doesn't spike you in the same way that, regular sugar would or certain types of sweeteners do. But propolis and our Be Smart as well, those are sugar free. I mean, first of all, there's no added sugar, but there's no added sugar in any of our products, but there's 0 grams of sugar. So we have people who are in ketosis who use propolis and Be Smart all the time. I tell those people, like, pollen might kick you out, honey will kick you out, but go for it with the Be Immune propolis spray and the Be Smart shots.
I mean, it really, the dose ultimately is what determines whether or not something is keto or not. There's like
Yeah.
this dogma in the keto space, I mean, like a teaspoon of sugar can be keto.
Yeah.
A cup of white rice can be keto if you're exercising vigorously. I mean, it's like they're carbs,
Mhm.
so they're sort of counterproductive to ketone generation, ketone production. But if if that's all you're consuming in a day, are you going to be kicked out of ketosis for any significant duration? No. So when people get that obsessive, I think it can be counterproductive and a little obsessive.
Totally agree. And such a big thing is like using honey, even people who are in ketosis, like using honey for sleep, a little bit of honey. If you're not having good sleep,
I know.
then what are you doing?
You're opening the door to so many different health
Yeah.
problems. So interesting. So what's next for Beekeepers Naturals? I mean, you guys have all these incredible products. You're at every major supermarket that I've seen. I always look out for you guys. What's on the horizon for you? What are you excited about?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm really excited about a product that we just came out with. I don't know if you've ever taken Halls or Ricola before, but we just came out with lozenges that
Amazing.
are really, really clean. I'll give you some to try. I think you have some actually, but I'm really excited about those. They've got zinc, vitamin D, propolis, and just a really clean ingredient profile. 1 gram of sugar per lozenge, 8 calories per lozenge, and you know, it's interesting when you look at lozenges. I like nerd out so hard on this because it literally took me like 3 years to make these lozenges because every hard candy manufacturer I went to was like, we need to use cane sugar as a binding agent or maltodextrin or aspartame. And I was like, well, we don't work with those ingredients. So no. But that's a product that we just launched. And then beyond that, we're really looking to reinvent the medicine cabinet and, clean up the medicine cabinet, things like our cough syrup, and then also just share the different powerful nutritive foods from the beehive and really make them mainstream. Like again, these are tools that everyone should be using. They're tools that humans have had in the toolkit for thousands of years, and we just really want to bring it back and bring it forward and give people a modern way to incorporate bee products into their life and have, the best experience they can.
I love it. How can people support bees?
Great question. So, big thing is pesticides. Really get to know what's happening on your lawn. I know a lot of people. So I was talking to someone the other day in LA who was a gardener, and they were telling me it's organic. And then they had this conversation with their gardener, and there's a lot of pesticides being used. So check out what's happening on your lawn. Go pesticide free. A great thing to do to support bees, and I do this in New York on my balcony. Have a Just plant some local flowers, like any
Mm.
kind of bright colored flowers. Make sure they're pesticide free. One of the things affecting bees is pesticides, of course, but the other is urbanization. There's not plentiful food for the bees. So if you can create a little bee habitat just by planting some organic flowers, great. Another thing is do your best to support small scale biodynamic pesticide free growers, because again, these are people who are creating food for the bees. And then we do a ton of stuff through the company. So we make like all of our swag, we give 100% of proceeds to our charity partners. We work really closely with UC Davis Bee Research. They're an unbelievable research institution. Check them out. You can also donate directly to them through Beekeepers. But they're doing all kinds of research just on how we can better support the bees and learn more about the integral roles bees play.
And
Um,
bee products, do they do any research on the bee products themselves?
they do, yeah, they do. A lot of recently, they're really focused on just because of the bee decline, how
Yeah.
we can support bees overall. But we've done all kinds of stuff with them.
Wow, that's amazing. I feel like people are going to be, a little bit trepidatious. Like they want us, they're going to, want to plant flowers on their balconies or whatever,
They're scared of bees coming.
but then they're going to have more bees around. So
So here's the thing, unless you're really getting in the bee's face, swatting at it, it's unlikely that it stings you. I
mm.
mean, again, like I've like gone into the hive, like put my hand inside their house, which is like, and that will be kind of in their face. But if you're outside in the garden, there's a few bees flying around, unless you're like really swatting at them or, wearing a ton of perfume or something that's really triggering, they're not going to come after you. They'll probably just help your flowers grow really beautifully.
Yeah, I think people these days they have an affinity for bees. I feel like there's been really great this incredible shift over the past couple of decades. I mean, people are still afraid of spiders. People are
Mhm.
definitely still afraid of like roaches and pests and things like that.
Yeah.
But bees, there is this sort of really benevolent, I think, morale that people have about bees.
Well, yeah, I think people are starting to understand that if we lose the bees, we are destroying the environment. Like we really do need the bees, and especially with the decline. I mean, can you imagine a world? Well, first of all, like the inflation on natural food. If we can't things, everything's bee pollinated: almonds, apples, avocados, blueberries. If we can't use bees to pollinate, like what are we going to do? Humans are going to hand pollinate with Q-tips. A blueberry would cost like $50,
Oh my God, yeah.
So it's really important just to preserve our food system, our natural food supply, then fruits and vegetables, that we support the bees.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one.
After seeing multiple specialists and finally getting somebody to perform some testing, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, which is an autoimmune disease. And I did what the doctors told me. I took all of the medications. I was on 100 milligrams of prednisone steroids, and I was in and out of the hospital constantly. I had multiple blood transfusions, was constantly needing iron infusions. I mean, just the gamut. Nearly lost my life a couple of times in those earlier days, just not understanding how severe the disease was and letting it get so far that I was just very, very, very morbidly anemic and lost, so much weight. And so after a few years of that and being young and not feeling like I was living the vibrant, 20 something life that I wanted, and newlywed life as well, I started just kind of trying to research on my own. I asked a lot of doctors, every doctor I saw, I asked if food could help. Ulcerative colitis is in your colon. So even though I didn't study nutrition or medicine in college, there was still something in my brain that was like, well, everything that I eat's going through there. So, is there something maybe that could be making it worse, or something that I'm not getting enough of? And they all told me that diet wouldn't cause, cure, or help it.
Mm.
And so it was a lot of years of just taking that, you kind of just trust what your doctors say. And it was a lot of years of feeling pretty hopeless. And then I stumbled upon a few things online. One of the medications I was on would cause me not to sleep at all for, 8 hours a night. I would just be wide awake. And so I would spend a lot of time on the internet. In 2007, there wasn't, social media wasn't really around. Facebook was new. It was mostly like medical chat boards, some blogs here and there, but not a lot. And I found just some people that were using diet to help their inflammation levels and to help their various autoimmune diseases, but specifically ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, and cutting out grains and dairy. And it was just kind of this glimmer of hope that there might be an alternative way. And that was really kind of what started me on the path to continuing to just read and research about it, and then eventually try, multiple different types of diets and lifestyles for myself until I found one that really helped to improve my symptoms.
Wow, what an incredible story. For listeners who are unfamiliar with autoimmunity, I mean, just at a 30,000-foot level, like what is it? What is autoimmunity?
Yeah, the way I like to describe it, and again, I'm not a doctor or scientist, but I've been living with this for 12 years, or 13 years. Autoimmune diseases are when your immune system is overactive and they attack an otherwise healthy organ that doesn't need to be attacked. It's kind of the way that I'm like, that's the easiest way to explain it to me. So for me, it's my colon, the white blood cells in there that are causing inflammation, and it's trying to fight something off that's not present. People can have, psoriasis, and it can attack their skin, MS. There's I think 180, 200 or so known autoimmune diseases. Then there's things like lupus that actually can affect your entire body. But essentially that's the way that I've come to understand it.
Wow. It's amazing that you, as you mentioned, you visited all these doctors and they gave to you basically what I've come to call diagnose and adios. They were just like,
yeah.
Take these drugs. There's this incredible meme. I don't know if you've seen it circulating on social media, but it's like there's a woman sitting on the, I don't know what it's called, but like the bench in the doctor's office, and she looks really unhappy, and she's got like spots all over her face, and she clearly, like, the cartoonist drew her to depict how miserable she was feeling, and the quote underneath,
right.
There's a doctor looking at her, and the doctor's like, well, all your labs look normal, looks like you're okay,
Right.
But I mean, so often there are these underlying latent conditions going on, and it really takes becoming your own health investigator, like what you've done, to get to the root cause. So I just want to
right.
like applaud you in your journey.
Well, thank you. It's when you feel that helpless and hopeless at that point, I think a lot of times it is hard for people to want to push through because it's just so much to think about, and you don't know the right questions to ask, and you don't know the right tests to request, and that's like something that you hope and expect your doctor to guide you towards. And I definitely had those frustrating. I mean, it took, multiple specialists to finally even get tests and then to be diagnosed. And then even after diagnosis, I was sent out the door after a week-long hospital stay of, this is what you have. It's uncurable. You'll have it for life, but just take this. And that was kind of it. They never actually even told me about autoimmunity. They didn't mention those, like that it was an autoimmune disease. They just, kind of sent me out, and then we asked why and, how, and that was just kind of like, well, we don't really know, and that was pretty much all the answers we got. So I had to take it into my own hands. It's also just the kind of person I am. But I just had to keep searching and researching and trying to learn about it on my own.
I love that. I can totally relate. So you mentioned that you were, you started scouring these online message boards back in 2007, and you stumbled upon this like grain-free, dairy-free lifestyle. When you first saw that mentioned, I mean, like what was going through your head? Because grains, because like growing up in the 80s and 90s, grains I thought were this amazing thing that you've got to eat 7 times a day, right?
Right. Right.
So like what was your...
definitely what we were taught.
Yeah.
You know what, to be quite honest with you, I remember being like, I don't even know what a grain is. Yes. Like I always heard whole grain is most, it's the healthiest and you're supposed to eat it all the time. And we got rid of like the Wonder Bread and started eating whole grain bread and that type of thing. But if you could have asked me to list the actual foods that were grains, I had no idea. So it was a massive learning curve for me. So I think when I first saw it, it probably didn't hit me just how much stuff I was going to have to cut out. It was more of just like, okay, well, this is working. Let's try to give it a shot. But when I really started flipping the ingredient list and looking and like, oh, wow, everything that I'm eating has, grains in it or dairy or soy or corn or, things like that. That was really the kind of eye-opening moment of like, okay, there's a lot we have to change here. And there's a lot I have to, go through and just completely like revamp my kitchen, revamp my pantry. And then on the other side of things, I didn't know how to cook, any other way. I mean, I was pretty young as it was and didn't do a whole lot of cooking in college, but anything I did know how to make came from my mom, my grandma, and it all used grains. So it was a fairly big shift. And it took me a long time. I might always like to say that because I think it's a mental thing for people, I mean, you're grieving your diagnosis and you're grieving all of these foods. And then you're just in this kind of deer in headlights kind of time for a little while where you're just like, I don't even know what to do. It's just so much. And then there's this commitment that you have to make, and that was mentally really hard for me. I'd commit and then I'd fall off and I'd go back and, and I wouldn't see the improvement that I wanted at first, but that's because maybe I was doing 5 days of doing well, but then I'd, go and eat whatever I wanted on the weekends. And so my body just wasn't even having time to recover. So it was a good few years before I really set, my mind to it and was like, no going back. This is it. This is the only way that I can live a full and happy life.
Did you, was there any point at which you grieved grains?
Oh yeah. I mean, grains, dairy, all of it. Yeah. I loved a baguette with cheese. Like I loved a good bowl of oatmeal in the morning. So yeah, there was a long period of time. I'm also like, I'm known now for my baked goods. And it's just, I grieved the celebratory things like, getting to throw a party for family and friends and having a cake or a pie or something like that. Or, I mean, it had been another wave when I had started having kids. I have 3 kids and I, went through this kind of wave at the beginning of my first son. He's 10 now, but just this feeling of like, oh, like moms are supposed to be able to make cookies with their kids and sit and enjoy them, or like there's a birthday party at school and I really want him to not feel left out. And so there were multiple kind of times where I grieved the foods that I couldn't have. And that's really what set me on the path of starting to create my own recipes, because I just was like, I refuse to be this young and live the rest of my life feeling like I'm missing out on all of the things that are important to me and the traditions and the like nostalgic times that I remember as a child.
Yeah. I mean, looking over your Instagram, it doesn't look like you're missing out on anything. It's just so, it's just so funny. Like growing up, like every meal had to have a grain for me,
right,
like it was either like a sandwich or a wrap or a brown rice bowl or whole wheat pasta. I remember being such a huge fan. I couldn't envision life without grains. But now it's funny, like not only do I never think about grains, I can't really envision life with them, or at least with them taking up the kind of real estate on my plate that they used to take up.
That's what I was going to say. They definitely took up. I mean, I was going to say the same word with real estate. It's like, I feel like that was the majority of what filled us up as kids. It was like a teeny portion of vegetables, if any, a little bit of meat, and then whatever it was, that big starch, on the side. And I always say, when I first started eating this way, paleo was very big. And that's the word that was used a lot just because it classified my recipes. And there was this, kind of caricature at the time going around with like a person just eating this like massive turkey leg, and that's kind of what people thought, that it was just all meat heavy all the time. And I always said I eat more vegetables now than I did before, because there's more space on my plate that I can fill. And I also realized just how nutrient dense and healthy they are and how great they are for my body. But I'm like, cutting out the grains didn't mean for me adding more meat necessarily or other things to fill that in. It was like, oh wow, I actually have expanded my view to eating and filling up more on vegetables.
Yeah, love that. Speaking of vegetables, so in your own personal health journey, there's a lot of talk these days about lectins, inducing what's called molecular mimicry, aggravating people's immune systems when they have active autoimmunity. So have you found that there are any vegetables that you seem to do better, without, or like what's your current diet look like these days?
So the only thing that I found, and it just depends, if I'm symptomatic, which this has not been a perfect journey. I actually had a really bad setback last year, but I've done incredibly well considering and compared to what I used to be. But when I'm symptomatic, vegetables are hard if they're not cooked. And that's pretty standard for anybody with a digestive disease, especially things like leafy greens and things like that. But otherwise, the only one that I don't do a lot of, or I don't really do at all, are white potatoes. And it kind of depends. I can do some nightshades, if they're cooked. I don't do a ton of tomatoes. But the lectin thing I think is interesting. I've been really trying to study and learn kind of over the last couple of years. It's fairly new, all things considered, with my full journey from 2007. But I haven't found it to be super detrimental for me, just in terms of like the seeds in a cucumber or things like that. But I do think there's something to it. And I think everybody's bodies are different. That's what I found. I'm like, I think there's this kind of good baseline, but then there might be nuanced things here and there. But yeah, really just raw stuff when I'm not feeling well. And then white potatoes just don't do well for me. They can cause inflammation and I get bloated and my joints can hurt and I just kind of stay away from them.
Oh man. Yeah, I didn't want it to sound like I was endorsing like removing lectins or anything like that. But
Yeah.
it's just been interesting because a lot of people today, whether it's, sort of a more well, I guess like Gundry-esque approach, who have cut the lectins
Right.
out or have gone full-blown carnivore. It just seems that, some
Mm.
people with active autoimmunity, like it's not just the removal of grains that bring on a reprieve
Right.
of symptoms. It's a more extreme version of that. So I was just wondering if you sort of
Yeah.
dabbled in any of those more extreme dietary patterns.
No, I haven't. Aside from paleo, or occasionally I kind of revert to like an autoimmune protocol when I'm not feeling well, which cuts out the nuts, the seeds, the nightshades. So that definitely is a little bit more extreme. But I found that I don't have to do that all the time, which I'm grateful for. It's really just in order to kind of get symptoms at bay. But really, for me, it's grain and dairy free, no refined sugars, no legumes. But in addition to that, I've found and really learned the hard way over the last few years that I actually really have to take care of my body as a whole. I have to make sure that I'm prioritizing rest. I have to make sure I'm prioritizing not being stressed and anxiety and all of those things. And they really kind of go hand in hand with the way that I eat.
Stress is massive. I mean, a
It's
stressful
huge.
event can cause a flare up, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think I knew that, but I didn't really take it seriously. And that's what put me into such a bad setback last year. I just didn't have the boundaries that I needed to and ran myself into the ground no matter how well I was eating. So I've learned my lesson, but I'm sure I'll probably, stumble again at some point.
Man, well, glad you're on the mend. So how did you then come to start your blog Against All Grain?
Yeah, so I started my blog in 2009, I believe. I might have started in 2008, but I didn't really touch on it. I was starting to get into the kitchen and create recipes. Again, it was like there might have been one or two blogs at that point. I don't think were any cookbooks, maybe very shortly thereafter. And so I just felt at a loss. I felt like the food I was eating was cardboard, and I just felt very deprived and was like, this is not the life I want. I grew up in a very large Italian family that hosted big. My grandmother still to this day, 86 years old, and still hosts our family, not right now, sadly, but and 30, 40 people at a time. And that was the way she showed her love, was through food. And that was really kind of how I felt too. I wanted to bring people around my table to create community around food. And I couldn't eat the chicken and steamed broccoli for the rest of my life. So I started getting into the kitchen and just recreating a lot of things that I grew up eating, like substituting out things for the regular dinner, recipes that I grew up eating. And then got into the baked goods. And my husband was the one who suggested starting a blog. He just was like, you should start a blog. And so he set me up with the WordPress, and I just started snapping photos of the things I was creating with my phone, and I was sharing the recipes with neighbors and coworkers, and they were all giving good feedback on them, and they would all ask for the recipes. And so I was like, well, it's an easier way to just type it up and put it up there and they can use it, and I don't have to hand it out to multiple people. And it was also just a way to kind of catalog my journey, and then eventually became a way to connect with other people who were suffering like I was. When I first started it, I just figured it would be like my grandma, my mom, and my sister that were reading it. But I started a Facebook page, I think around 2011, and started publishing the recipes there, and just started seeing it grow and grow. And I think probably the biggest thing that I noticed where people were feeling the same, they just like really wanted to be able to enjoy those pastimes, especially other parents and things like that. But that also they just needed to find somebody who knew what they were going through. And that's what I felt like I needed too. I didn't have anybody in my life that was walking the same journey of going through an autoimmune disease. And so I think we just kind of formed this community and this bond, which I've been so grateful for over the years. But yeah, that's kind of how it started. It started with just me in the kitchen, just experimenting.
It's so cool. And so that kind of blossomed into these 4 cookbooks that you've written at this point?
Yeah, it did. So about a year or so after I started the blog, I got a call from a publisher, and they offered me a deal. And The story I thought was cool was because the woman who worked there, son had an autoimmune disease, and he was young, and he went to a school where they had cereal day every week, and he couldn't do grains, and he felt super left out. And I have this granola recipe that's like soaked in sprouted nuts that are dehydrated. And sweetened with honey, and so she would make that for him and send it with almond milk or something like that, or coconut milk, and he felt like he could be part of the celebration every week again. And so she showed my blog to the publisher, and that's how my first book came about. And then it went on from there.
That's amazing. How do you?
Yeah.
You mentioned that you have 3 kids. I mean, I don't have any. I don't have any kids that I know of, at least. So this is not a topic that I can speak to particularly well. But how do you balance? Like, how do you balance being a mom, having 3 kids around, having these dietary restrictions with kids who basically want to eat whatever is pleasurable to them?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. So for my first son, at first I just didn't realize, like, I was changing everything about the way I was eating, but I was still doing all the normal quote unquote things that most American parents do for their kids, like buying the, box flaked oatmeal or rice cereal that you mix up, or giving them, all the like cheese crackers, the fish crackers, just all those things that I just were like, oh, okay. And then I started moving into kind of like, okay, well, I should at least get organic versions of those. So it was a kind of a slow process. But then after time, I just realized, like, if this is as important to my body as it is, and I started learning more and more about how autoimmune diseases can be hereditary. My children were also born via C-section, which can make them even more susceptible to it. And so it really became a passion of mine to make sure that I tried to prevent at all costs that they would get what I had. So my younger 2 have just kind of been raised on it. I think they know spaghetti squash, and they know, that's like, they don't know normal noodles. They do a little bit. I always say, they're 100% gluten-free. 85% of the time they eat grain-free, paleo kind of diet, but then I'll buy like some whole brown rice pasta for them because they can tolerate it. And it doesn't seem to bother them, but we do no artificial sugars, no artificial food dyes, everything's pretty clean. But that's partially why I became passionate about recreating the things like the cupcakes and the cookies and things, because they're going to be exposed to that kind of stuff. And it doesn't matter how much you tell a 5-year-old that it's the best for them, that they don't eat it. It's like, they need to at least feel like they're part of it. And so I send, my own cupcakes to school for them, or they keep like a bag in the freezer of something of mine, so that when there's a party at school, they can like pull it out. And that was very apparent early on, as like even a preschooler, sending different snacks to school, and just how they as they're growing up, they're learning how to be part of society and how, to be part of the world. And it's really surprising how much food is a part of that, and how you can really feel ostracized, based on how you eat. And I'm like, I felt it as an adult, so I can't even imagine a little one. So we talk a lot, about my disease. Unfortunately, they have seen me, bedridden at times here and there. They've seen me sick. And so without trying to scare them, we talk about why it's important that we eat this way, and that it helps mommy stay healthy, so that I can be, there for them. And I think they really understand it. Again, like, they're going to be 16, and they're going to go to a friend's house and probably down like 4 boxes of mac and cheese. And it's going to happen at some point. Like, I know it's going to. But the biggest thing for me is trying to help them see the correlation of how their body feels after they eat things. We've had those circumstances here and there over the years of like going to a movie with a friend and getting the candy and popcorn and coming home and feeling gross and their stomach hurts. And, I try to tell them like, hey, did you feel like that before you went to the movie and before you ate that? And so just really trying to just show them to like listen to their bodies. That's kind of the way I've tried to approach it. And they're going to make bad decisions, but my hope is that the foundation that's laid, and just trying to understand from a young age that food can make you feel a certain way, but good or bad, that they'll hopefully make good decisions as they get older.
I love that. Like a gentle coaxing.
Yeah, exactly.
Is all it takes. Yeah. I ate tons of crap growing up.
I know. Same.
Tons, like McDonald's. I remember Lunchables, Dunkaroos.
Oh, yeah.
Fruit roll-ups,
all
Pop-Tarts,
of it. We
cereal.
must have grown up around the same time, because those were all the things. Yes, all of them. Pizza pockets or hot pockets.
Yeah.
I mean, my mom was like the queen of frozen processed foods. And that was I feel like our generation. That's just, it's stuff we grew up on. Sometimes I poke fun at her and I'm like, you wonder why I have this disease, but it's something they couldn't, they didn't know any better. But yeah, I had the friends, I feel like we all had, especially kids who grew up in like the 90s, we all had that one friend whose mom was very like super strict. They never ate chocolate. They only ate carob, or they only ate like the whole grains, or they were never allowed this or that. And then you went to college with that friend and they like just like nosedive, ate all the things. And so I'm like, my thought with raising my kids, I'm like, I'm not going to try to, I don't want to deprive them. I don't want them to go off and like try to rebel and go the other direction. I want to like bring them into it. They cook a lot with me. I want to talk with them. Like I want to, try to have them have this understanding and belief of it, that it's not just something that like I'm imposing on them.
Yeah, I love that. How do you handle eating out, going to restaurants?
Well, so I live in the Bay Area, so I'm pretty fortunate in that like most of the restaurants around here are really accommodating. I mean, I feel like from when I was diagnosed, especially where you would say gluten-free and they'd look at you like you had like 5 heads, to now even understanding grain-free. So, I mean, most menus these days have it listed what things can be modified or what's gluten-free. Thankfully, I don't have celiac, so I can eat in a place that's cross-contaminated. I'm not that sensitive to gluten, at least. But when I travel, which I do a lot for work normally, not this year, I tend to find places that I spend a lot of time on Yelp. My friends always make fun of me because I'm like looking for lunch when we're at breakfast of like, okay, where can we go that's safe? But I like to try to find places that I know have good quality, like grass-fed meats and organic, poultry and local organic vegetables. And then I know like, okay, I can probably modify something if they're like at least focusing on quality. Worst case scenario, if I'm like stuck, I'll get a salad and I'll just do olive oil and lemon juice, or I'll get a lettuce wrap burger or something if like I'm stuck and I just can't. But for the most part around here, we can eat pretty easily and we can actually really enjoy a lot of the places, which I'm super grateful for.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel like California, we're so lucky living in this state,
Yes.
in many ways.
Yes.
in the sense that we, it really is the epicenter of the healthy, holistic food movement, whatever you want to call it, in the U.S. And it has been that way for decades.
Right. And everything's so fresh too. I mean, it's like our produce, and it's like we can get mostly everything year round. I mean, we're very fortunate in that way. And there's such, I mean, I think this is where like the farm to table, kind of movement originally kind of started, I feel like, just with everything being local and fresh, and that's such a priority. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely easier here than it is in some places in the Midwest and the South. That's for sure.
So you've talked about how you've been able to adapt some of your indulgences to your new lifestyle, all the baked goods that pepper your Instagram so beautifully. What about what's your take on alcohol and how that affects ulcerative colitis?
Yeah, so I don't do any grain-based alcohol, clearly, although I am somewhat of the mind that it's kind of not fermented, but distilled out. But still, I kind of stay away from it. I just don't know how it's going to react. I occasionally will do 100% agave tequila. I like a good margarita that's made with honey. That's like if I'm gonna do something as a drink, like I'll make something like that. I love a glass of red wine. I've over the last 5 or 6 years, I've realized that if I drink a glass that's organic and biodynamic, doesn't have any added sugars and the sulfites and the coloring, that I can tolerate it just fine. I mean, again, it's like if I'm noticing any sort of symptoms, I just stay away from any of that stuff because it does still have, natural sugars. And, but yeah, again, I'm 35 minutes from the Napa Valley. So I love a good glass of wine. But I don't, none of the sugary like cocktails or mixers or anything like that. But yeah, I think on occasion, I mean, maybe I don't even do a drink a week. I would say maybe a couple times a month I have a glass of something, but I'm not too strict on that.
Yeah. I think like in so far as alcohol has this ability to reduce stress for people,
Yeah.
That's
right,
like a non-trivial benefit of drinking alcohol, even though alcohol itself is a toxin, right? It's like,
right.
We live these stressed out lifestyles, like 2020 was a stressful year. And, and I'm not being I don't think alcohol needs me to come out in its defense, but like But when you have an autoimmune condition and stress can, lead to flare-ups, it's like it's nice to know
You're
that you
right.
can have like a glass of wine at the end of the day.
Right, right. And actually, yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I mean, I'm sure it's somewhat controversial. I do some CBD, which I think helps with stress as well. And that might be a little safer than alcohol. But yeah, I have not noticed it. I mean, I definitely hear from people with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's that alcohol or wine can really bother their systems. But when I switched to like quality wine that I knew was grown and harvested and produced in a way that wouldn't affect me, I've actually noticed a pretty significant difference.
Hmm.
So, but again, like I can't do too much. I mean, I need to, it's within moderation for me. But yes, 2020, a glass of wine at the end of the day with 3 kids at home and trying to run a business. It's definitely been a stress reliever. That's for sure.
That's awesome. When it comes to baking, what are some of your favorite, I don't know, things to make, ingredients to use? I dabble in baking,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that I'm a pro by any means, but I've got some like recipes that I've gotten pretty good at over time. So like what are some of your go-tos?
It depends. I used to use a ton of almond flour, which I mean, I still use here and there, but I've noticed so many people have nut allergies. I've actually noticed that if I go overboard on like the nut flours too, that I can kind of backtrack a little bit. I use coconut flour. I like arrowroot starch or arrowroot powder here and there just to kind of give something like a more kind of pliable texture and a little bit of a crunch. My favorite sweeteners would be raw, just like very, very light colored honey. That's my favorite. I think I love the flavor of honey, but you don't want to overpower it. Maple sugar, pure maple sugar has been one of my favorite kind of new finds in the last couple years. Like there are just certain things you can't get without a granulated sugar in terms of texture. And so I've loved using that. Coconut sugar, it's been great to use and that's been around for so long, but it's very dark. It's like more like brown sugars. So maple sugar has been one of my favorite things to be able to recreate like sprinkles for my kids. Like I couldn't do that before that. Or French macarons. Like there's just certain things that you can't get. But I'm trying to think what else. I do. I love to use nut butters just because they're already super smooth and you don't get that kind of like gritty, grainy texture that you can get with some of the flours. So I use that a lot, like almond butter or sunflower seed butter in muffins or in breads, things like that. I think that's kind of it. I'm like, those are like the main things in my pantry.
I like it. Well, have you not dabbled with like some of these like sugar-free, calorie-free sugar alternatives like erythritol, monk fruit, stevia? What are your thoughts on those?
So 100% stevia I think is fine. I'm not a huge fan of the sugar alcohols. My body doesn't tend to like them. I also just don't like the flavor. I feel like they have such an interesting aftertaste. So I don't use them much. Stevia occasionally, but I kind of prefer like the regular like honey, maple syrup, those types of things. And dates. I use a lot of dates. That's another sweetener that I use.
That's cool. Yeah, I don't know. I like I'll use erythritol, doesn't upset my stomach at all. But I know that some sugar alcohols have a very pronounced, GI like distress effect.
Yeah.
But
that might be why for me, I'm like,
yeah. Interesting.
Again, I'm like, everybody's different.
Everybody's different. I don't know if you know this. This is something that I thought was very interesting. Prunes are very high in, I believe it's sorbitol, which is a sugar alcohol.
Interesting. Yeah. I had no idea.
Yeah, which is why prunes are such a well-known, they have this like well-known laxative effect.
Right.
It's not because of the fiber in the prunes. It's because of that sugar alcohol. So if you look at, and what's funny is that you'll look at like, if you go to Trader Joe's or whatever, you find these like sugar-free chocolate bars or whatever, they're loaded with sorbitol.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so
it's funny. My husband will probably be so mad at me for saying this, but I had never heard the word sorbitol until he told me that it bothered his stomach. He doesn't have any autoimmune disease, nothing, but he used to chew gum that had sorbitol in it, and he would notice like he would get very gassy. So, and that's when I first realized, I was like, oh, I wonder if, some of these other ones might be causing that with me. So, I mean, it's all about like trying to listen to your body and hear the different things. But I think I'm open to some of them. I think the biggest problem for me, I get a lot of fans asking like, can I substitute in stevia? Can I substitute in monk fruit? And the problem is a lot of the brands that are out there have so many extra things in them. I'm like, it's pretty difficult you have to really seek out and look at the ingredients to find like a pure monk fruit sweetener. sweetener that doesn't have a bunch of other stuff in it. And same for the stevia. But yeah, I mean, I occasionally have this like powdered 100% stevia that's just like the ground leaves that I think works really well. That's probably my favorite alternative if I were to use it.
That's awesome. You mentioned that you've made sprinkles for your kids.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I have. They were for one of my books. I have a book called Eat What You Love, and the whole premise around it was just everything that you would want to eat. You can. That's, grain and dairy and refined sugar free. So yes, I made sprinkles. I was making a frosting at one point with like a royal icing that I would have, you would have used to make sugar cookies. And it's typically an egg white base that has powdered sugar in it. And that's when it kind of crisps up at the end. And so I was making a frosting. I was testing out recipes with the egg whites and with a little starch and some maple sugar. And when it dried, I was like, oh, this actually has the texture of like a sprinkle. So I started doing some, natural like food colorings with beets and with blueberries and dyeing them and piping them out. And then you just chop them up. And it's a little bit of a process, but for like your kids who just want to, they see their friends eating sprinkles on ice cream or on top of cookies or something like that. It was a fun one to kind of figure out. And I was like, oh, you can actually make sprinkles. It's not that hard.
Man, how lucky are your kids? Jesus.
Well, I mean, I'm sure they probably feel lucky and unlucky. Actually, I don't think they even appreciate it. Let's be honest. I'm like, it's just normal for them. So,
So funny. So you've got this new digital cooking course coming out.
Yes.
That I'm sure your followers are excited for. What's that about?
Yeah, it's something that I've been wanting to do for a really long time, and 2020 kind of gave me that opportunity. I obviously none of us are traveling, and that's what takes up a lot of my time. But traveling for me is a chance to connect with the people who follow me, who buy the books, who have followed the recipes, who have seen major change in their lives because of the shifts in their diet. And so I've really missed that part specifically. But then we also just really found over the years that and I was at the beginning too, a lot of people are really intimidated by cooking in a totally new lifestyle and with different ingredients. And when I will make something on my Instagram and show how easy and how normal it looks, like it actually looks like good food when it comes out. We see so many more people that are willing to take the risk of trying it themselves. Like, so all of a sudden, I'll see thousands of people post the same recipe that I made the day before because it inspires them, and they see like, oh, coconut aminos, they look like soy sauce. Like at first I was worried because I didn't know what that was, but they look, like the food that I remember, or like that, that dinner looks exactly like the regular dinner that I grew up eating. And so I've really wanted to create this community of, like-minded people who have health in mind, who want to eat healthier, but might be intimidated by cooking for their family or for themselves, and that really want to learn how to cook. I mean, you can't go to culinary school. You can't watch the Food Network and see this way of cooking. And so this was kind of my way of getting to do that and really getting to be in people's kitchens with them. It's going to be a lot different than what I do on a day-to-day basis on my social media. It's like we're really cooking through the recipe together. We're not editing a 3 to 5 minute cooking video. Like we're going to show the whole, 20, 30 minute process of this. We're going to talk about the tips and tricks of what to look for in the grocery store and what something looks like, when it's almost done, and what it looks like when it's undercooked. And they just really get to see the full process. And then there's going to be a lot more in terms of like really forming a community. When I went on my book tour for my last book, what I noticed as I visited each city was that there were so many people that came out to the event alone. They drove, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and they didn't come with anybody because they didn't have anybody that was interested in it. They didn't have that support system. And so I started just to have this idea of like, gosh, wouldn't it be so cool if there's 400 people sitting in this room that obviously all care about this. Like, couldn't we connect you all where you can give each other tips, about like, oh, well, I found coconut, crystals, coconut milk at this store in this aisle, or this restaurant's really accommodating to, gluten-free or grain-free, and where people in individual places could really also kind of form a community and where they could become each other's resources and connect over that. So that's kind of the hope and the goal of all of this, is not only will they be learning to cook with me and cooking with me, but that they're also, all the participants will kind of form this community together where they can really empower each other and really encourage each other. And kind of inspire each other to try the recipes or to try something new or substitute something in if they can't have it. But yeah, that's kind of the hope, and really just giving people more of like an inside look at kind of my day-to-day tips and tricks that I've learned over the last 12 years of cooking this way and making it a profession, but also having 3 kids, and just like my tips on, batch cooking dinners and freezing things and just all of that, like really a more intricate look into kind of what my real kitchen and my life looks like.
That's amazing. I'm sure that course is going to be so valuable to people who take it. I didn't know this about you prior to doing the research, on you leading up to this, to our chat, but you're a self-taught chef. You're a self-taught chef who has 4 cookbooks, 3 of which are New York Times bestsellers, which is amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
So great. I mean, so inspiring to anybody out
Thank
there
you.
listening who aspires to do something in the world of food, and chefery. But what are some things that you know now that you wish you knew about cooking back when you first started?
Oh gosh. I think, I think one of the biggest things for me was, I wasn't trained. I didn't go to school. I really never veered from a recipe. So I think probably the biggest thing for me is to take risks and to like experiment. I think people are so afraid that if they go off of a recipe at all, that it won't work and it'll flop. Baking, that's a little bit more tricky, but like for dinners, I just feel like people don't feel like they have the freedom to take a recipe and kind of make it their own. So I think that would be my biggest advice, was just to have some fun with it and to not feel like you really have to, stay within the guidelines. I mean, obviously don't change anything significant, but like swap your vegetables that you like in, or if you need to use stuff up in your fridge, do that. I think the other big thing that I've learned, especially, with trying to run a business full time and having kids, is to just really try to plan ahead. I mean, my early days, I think I had good intentions, but I would like go into the grocery store without a plan and end up with so much food at the house that I would end up wasting, 2 weeks down the road that I'd find in the fridge. And I'm like, oh, I thought I was going to use that, but I didn't. So I've really used meal planning a lot more, even if it's a little bit of a loose meal plan for me. But just that I'm buying things intentionally, that I have ideas for what to use them for. Also, like just using them up, when I see something that's about to go bad, I just really like, if I didn't have a recipe, just to like throw it into something and use it up. That's probably the other thing too. Cause it's just, I mean, eating this way is expensive for people at first, but I honestly think one of the biggest reasons why it's so costly is these people, I think there's a lot of food waste. I think it's a way to really get it down, to be more budget friendly.
Yeah, absolutely. Meal prep is such a great way to, stay on track in terms of your health goals, in terms of your budgetary goals. Any other mistakes that you'd routinely make back then? I feel like for new chefs, one of the things that I notice, for example, I'll go first, is that people tend to undersalt foods.
Oh, yes.
They tend to under season. That's one of the major reasons why I think so many children grow up, become adults that have this aversion to vegetables, because their parents didn't make them taste good, because they tasted terrible. Yeah, they tasted terrible growing up. I was very lucky in that my mom always, made vegetables very well seasoned. She did a great job there. But any like things like that.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I totally echo you on that. That's one thing I learned over the years is you also have to season in layers. Like you season as you go, because it builds on the flavors, and yeah, I like to do it as you go. But I do always say, I'm like, go as you go, and you can always add more at the end. You can't take it out. So that's the only thing I always caution people. I'm like, don't dump 2 teaspoons in at the beginning, because then you're screwed and you can't fix it. Yeah. But I utilize a ton of fresh herbs and dried spices. I think they can make any meal just to have so much more vibrancy and flavor, that might otherwise be a little bit boring. But yeah, I think too, and as a mom, like don't underestimate, your palate, and don't just turn something off because you don't think you'll like it or they'll like it. There was, one thing that I used to make all the time when my 10-year-old was 2, and it was just this really simple curry dish that with like 5 or 6 different vegetables with a little coconut milk and like 6 different dried spices. Kind of more of an Indian Thai. Well, it was like a mix between an Indian and a Thai curry, but I would always eat it at lunch, and I'd give him his normal, like finger foods and things. And he took a bite of it one time and ended up downing the whole bowl. And I just thought it wasn't spicy, but it had spices. It had turmeric and it had ginger and, cumin and coriander. And I never in my, wildest dreams would have thought a 2-year-old would like that. And so after that, I really started having that, thing of like, just try a bite. And it's kind of the same for adults, like even if it's something that might be a little bit different flavor profile than what you're used to, give it a shot. Like try it one time and see, because it could really, expand what your taste buds are used to. And you might end up finding that you love it.
Spices are so great. Herb spices, that they also add like negligible calories to your food,
Right.
whereas
So
like
true.
sauces and dressings, I mean,
Yes.
you're easily loading on the oil, the sugar, and things like that. So
Yes.
great to know
Totally.
how to wield a spice in the kitchen.
Yeah. It's true.
At what
Yeah, and
age?
don't be afraid to mix them. That's the other thing too. I'm like, don't just go with one. Like mix a bunch of different ones, because that's like where the flavor bombs come from.
Interesting. What do you have any favorite combinations?
You know what? I have the weirdest combination. I have this recipe on my site that's called I call it burnt broccoli. And it's because a friend of mine husband, he used to roast broccoli and like practically burn it, like charred roasted broccoli. And I started doing it, but adding this like lemon juice and this whole spice mix. And it's when you look at the spices, you wouldn't think that it would taste good together, but it's so good. It has cumin, coriander, cinnamon, just like a teeny bit of cinnamon, turmeric. I'm trying to think what else is in it, but that's kind of like I love coriander and cumin together for sure. And then I
Hmm.
usually kind of tried to add a couple others in there. But yeah, I definitely those would be some of my favorites.
Love that. So important. At what age can you, because I know you're not supposed to give, and you've gone through this 3 times, babies salt, right? But you can give them
Yeah,
like other spices are okay. And at what age can you
yeah,
can you start to give them salt?
yeah. Salt. Gosh, I think, I mean, I think it's okay. I think they worry about them. I think they worry about dehydration, but also that they'll like turn down any food that's not salty.
Hmm.
So I didn't salt a lot of foods, but I started putting spices in. Like if, I mean, for my first two, I did purees. We did like a baby led weaning for my third one, which is like where they're picking up pieces. But I would sprinkle cinnamon. I would sprinkle, like, I mean, all sorts of different things on their food just to get them used to all of the different flavors. I mean, not a lot, just a little bit, but yeah, I mean, babies, I mean, they're obviously new to it, and so, but like boring, bland food is not really fun for anybody. I mean, at the beginning, yes, like just the very simple things, but I think in order to get them to try things and like things and not always just want them bland, you have to start introducing it. I mean, it depends when your kids start eating, but usually after a couple months of solid foods is when I would start sprinkling different spices and seasonings in there.
What do you do if they don't want, a given food? Like what are your coercion methods?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. When they're babies and they're like newly eating, they're gonna take and pick up what they want and they're gonna put in their mouths what they want. So there's not a whole lot you can do there. I really did find with my third one with that, they call it baby led weaning. I didn't exactly follow it to a T, but serving them what we were eating was
Hmm.
huge for me. For them to see it on my plate and just to have it, being on their tray, but looking slightly different and really just giving them that kind of ownership and control over it, that there's 4 things on their tray and they can choose which one to pick up. I felt like that was super helpful. But really, I think for my kids, as they got older, for me, I think the biggest ticket to getting them to try things is getting them in the kitchen with you,
Hmm.
or getting them into the garden if you can have a small garden. Like when we first planted, I mean, we had 2 beds. It wasn't huge, just small little, like square beds, but we grew vegetables that, again, I think a lot of parents underestimate what their kids will like, and they just, buy like the standard, kid vegetables or like, and we planted, snow peas and we planted cucumbers and we planted tomatoes. And I just remember watching like them planting them as a seed and then having them grow and get to pick them. They took bites right then and there in the garden because it was like, I made this. And cucumbers are now, all 3 of my kids, they walk around with like the little baby cucumbers and just eat them like an apple in my house. And I'm like, I don't think I would have bought cucumbers for my kids, honestly. Like it's not something, I always think of those being in salads, and I just don't think I would have like given them as a snack. So I think getting them involved, whether it's the growing, it's the tasting. I mean, like I have my kids smell the spices before we put them in stuff. I have them, taste things. I just think it's really helpful for them to get to see the process, whatever it is, because it's like they have this ownership over it of like, oh, I helped with that. I made that. And it also really, it sparks their curiosity, because it's like they saw it, being made, and they're like, well, I want to see what it tastes like, and they don't always like it. And that's fair. Like it's, for me, I'm like, okay, you tried it. And if they don't like it, usually what I'll do is not let them eat. They don't have to eat it, but we'll try it again, like in a few months or a year. Cause their palates, especially when they're young, are like constantly changing. I mean, one of the things I always tell parents when they're feeling like super frustrated, and they'll look at, they'll look at my kids, and I'll be like, I write cookbooks for a living, but I still have a normal, like, picky child. Like, it's part of growing up. Kids just do it. It's like them figuring out their voice, and, but they will eat. I mean, my kids would eat at 2, they'd eat salmon and they'd eat asparagus and they eat like anything I put on their plates. But then 3 weeks later, they'd be tossing it off and like completely refusing it. So they just go through cycles. And I think, just constantly reintroducing and retrying things is huge.
I love that. I was a very picky eater growing up, and my mom always my mom she always used to tell me in a loving, smirking, humorous way. She had a great sense of humor. Not in a reprimanding way, that if I didn't become more experimental with food, that I'd be boring, as an adult. And I never wanted to be boring. So that's how she would get me to try new things like sushi and, more exotic dishes and the like. So.
Yeah, I like that. I know. I tell my oldest is our pickiest. My younger 2 are very adventurous. They try pretty much anything. They don't always like it, but they at least try it. My oldest, I always joke with him, because I'm like, for probably the first like 6 or 7 years of his life, he didn't like chocolate. And I'm like, if you would, and now he loves it, and he'll, ice cream or whatever. And I'm like, if you would have never tried that, you would never have known you liked it, and look at how much you'd be missing out. And I'm like, what if you love this vegetable, or what if you love this dinner, So I like try to kind of equate it to that too. I'm like, how will you know if you like something, or how will you know if you're not missing out on something unless you at least give it a shot? So that's kind of our rule. I'm not like a clean your plate type of mom. I'm like, give it a shot. And then our typical rule for dinner, if it's something new, is like, if they don't like something, if they try it, they don't have to finish it, but they can have more of whatever else I'm serving. I'm not going to go into the kitchen and make them something else. It's like, you can have, if you don't like the meat, but you love the broccoli, you can have a plate of broccoli for dinner. Like that's it. I'm not making a second dinner.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Is the idea of eating real food that doesn't have an ingredient list, that isn't ultra processed, that isn't hyper palatable things that come in boxes. I still think that makes a lot of sense, and it makes a lot of sense as a starting point for a lot of people. And then you can do your tweaking and your personalizing from there. But whether you like the name or not, I still think it's a good starting point.